And I came to Irish music. And what I really enjoy about this is that you can put your own ideas and creativity into it. And that was one thing like that I found personally that you couldn't do in orchestra at school. You know, you had to play exactly what was on the sheet, you know, same bowing and everything like that. And, you know, here, you know, you get to go beyond the notes on the tune and stuff like that. And I just think it's great. And the best thing about it is that we all get along. You know, it's more than just, you know, sitting around and playing tunes. We get to talk to each other, you know, we have laugh, you know, and everything like that.
I want to welcome each and every one of you here today. I am certainly overwhelmed by the presence of so many new faces, a new audience. I definitely am overwhelmed, and I just want to applaud you for coming out for this event. To tell you a little bit about the Bronzeville Historical Society, I just want to briefly say I shared with Tamara a little earlier that the Bronzeville Historical Society actually started as a result of my children begging me to not give them a history lesson whenever I drove to my mother's house. Each time we drove down King Drive, I would annotate or point out that, oh, there's where Harold Washington lived, or there's where Ida B. Wells lived. And as a result of that, we got together with friends and colleagues. I'm a 23-year postal employee, and have all of the board of directors here are basically postal workers as well. Can you guys raise your hand? Yeah, I'm going to do that. Without these wonderful people, I would not have access to the enormous amount of history that lies undocumented in the African American community. And one of the things that we are talking about today is, of course, quilts. And quilts in my family, and of course many black families, represent hope, represents love, represents a collective effort to either direct people to freedom, a signal for many African American slaves came through quilts, hand signals, handshakes. If you don't know, if you've ever watched black men shake hands, that same handshake can follow all over the world. And it's amazing how it changes and twists and reshapes. And the same goes true for how we've been able to communicate through the quilt. The quilt that you see to the far left is a recent collaboration of my mom, Doris Davis. Mom, raise your hand. Oh yeah, my left, you're right. Pat Bearden, who will be coming to you lately, actually suggested that we find a way to collaborate the effort to continue to document African American experiences through faces on quilts. And so just 2 weeks ago, Pat solicited probably 50 people, and all over the city and other states, we were able to get the faces, the fabric, and take it to my mom and make her make the quilt. And so I'm sure she enjoyed it. But I want to pause right here now to bring to the podium the wonderful friend and colleague, Ms. Pat Bearden. I'm sorry, Kathy, I apologize. Kathy O'Neill, please, give her a hand.
My name is Kathy O'Neill, and I'm the PR manager of the Irish American Heritage Center. The Irish American Heritage Center is the premier Irish cultural organization in the Midwest and one of the biggest in the country. We host more than 100 events per year, and we feature poetry, dance, music, theater, and proudly children's programming, like you see here today. We have a 658-seat theater, a choir, a theater troupe, a library, a museum, and classrooms for teaching, music, dance, and language. We host an outdoor festival and one of the largest family St. Patrick's Day events in the city. That's a little bit about who we are. But who we aren't is green beer and leprechauns. Our organization is about maintaining our culture and our identity, dispelling myths, which sadly still exist today. It is a concern of ours, and we are a proud, highly visible group of people who make up a sizable part of America through our involvement in politics, law, religion, public service, entertainment, and education. Robert Kennedy, John Ford, Sandra Day O'Connor, and Michael Moore. That is Irish America, and the Irish American Heritage Center is proud to be a part of it. Today, we hope to show you who we are and who we aren't, where we've been and where we're going, and I thank you for the opportunity to do that today.
Hi, and thanks for coming out. I'm Mario Longoni. I'm the Cultural Connections Program Coordinator at the Field Museum's Center for Cultural Understanding and Change, and there won't be a quiz on that later, so you don't have to retain it all. But I do want to really welcome all of you on behalf of really all of the Cultural Connections partners. There's 23 partners, so today is just a sampling of having 2 partners do a collaborative presentation for you, but we have these programs throughout the year. Now, today's program is being filmed in a collaboration between Cultural Connections and CAN TV, and it'll air twice at scheduled times that you can find in your cable listing, and that'll be in something like 2 to 3 weeks. So you just want to watch your cable listing for that if you want to see it again, or share that information with friends or family so they can check it out. Also today, we have WBEZ's Chicago Amplified Initiative with us, and they're recording it for downloadable podcast from the WBEZ website. And again, you would go to their website, and it would be wbez.org/programs/amplified if you're looking for that. Cultural Connections is a partnership of 23 cultural centers and ethnic museums with the Field Museum, and we hold events like today's to look at themes of similarity and difference within and among communities from across the Chicago region. It's unique for being a really large partnership of organizations, but also because we bring you to the partner organization locations. And Chicago History Museum is a Cultural Connections partner, so we really have 3 of them here today. And then also we organize events around a framework for understanding cultural diversity, and we call that framework Common Concerns, Different Responses. It really makes simple the idea that as human beings we face certain universal challenges that every community, every culture has to respond to meet, to be successful. We're all familiar with food, clothing, shelter. Those are the ones that always get named, but you also want to think about things like bringing children up to be responsible adults, or communications within your community, creating community bonds, and then also finding meaning in life, deciding what is a community we find meaningful. So those are all things that every culture has to solve, but in different places and different communities we do that in different ways. So for instance, communities might unite around a large festival, say Mardi Gras, or smaller informal gatherings. Think about attending church services on Sunday. And while the same people often participate in both kinds of gatherings, there's real differences in how different communities go about each of these. So one weekly gathering may be austere and quiet, while another is rowdy and rambunctious. Or one festival is organized and very carefully planned, while another one comes together very spontaneously, even if dependably. So it's these kinds of differences in the responses to common concerns that are the cultural differences we see in Chicago and around the world. And it's really cultural difference that as social scientists we're talking about when we say cultural diversity. Sometimes you'll hear people say somebody comes from a diverse community, and that means that they come from, say, an ethnic or racial minority group, and it makes it sound as though some people have culture and some people don't. And I think that's also another popular misconception, is that some people have culture and some don't. Really, even if we're all going to the mall in the next 3 or 4 weeks and picking up gifts for Christmas, that's part of our cultural practice here in America. And it's unique and distinct to us, although becoming more and more global. So think about it in that way. And so the Common Concerns, Different Responses framework is a way for you to understand diversity and to do the comparison between the presentations that you see today. So all of our cultural responses are shaped by three factors: our community's history, the environment, and then also human creativity. By history, we're talking about the accumulated knowledge of a community, their shared outlook that's been shaped and handed down through generations. By resources, we mean the resources that you have at hand to solve problems, or maybe the resources that you don't have at hand and have to figure out how to do without. And then creativity is really that ability to use your resources and take your particular worldview, your knowledge, and solve the challenges that you face. So it's differences in environment and history that combine with the spontaneous element of creativity to give rise to cultural diversity. Each year's Cultural Connections program has a different theme. This year's theme is creating community. Now, under this theme, we're looking at how people come together. And that's both in a literal sense, like we're doing today, but also in a sense, how do people come to have a similar worldview, a similar outlook, a way of approaching things. We're exploring how members of communities come to identify with one another based on shared ideas and shared experiences, and then they draw on these connections to build meaningful and fulfilling lives. At our last event, partner presenters considered how Japanese Americans and Brazilian Americans used annual festivals in Chicago to both develop their internal sense of their communities, but also to present a positive image of themselves to the wider Chicago and Chicago region community. Now today, we'll hear a comparison of how playing Irish music and African American quilting can bring people together and sometimes engender a shared sense of identity. During the program, we're going to ask you to pay attention to who's coming together to create art and who's coming together to appreciate, say, completed art, using it as an educational tool or a unifying symbol. And think about, do the different reasons for gathering create different kinds of bonds? And in what ways are these bonds still similar? Now, this kind of critical listening and reflecting is really taking an anthropological approach to learning, and that's what we're going to ask you to do while you're here today. So to do that, there's really just three things for you to do. The first is to be a sharp observer. This means paying attention and questioning even outside of the presentation proper. When you were coming in today, what was interesting or unique about this neighborhood? We've got a major religious institution, a major cultural educational institution, a lake, a park, all together in one place. How does that come to pass in Chicago, that these kinds of resources are together? That's the kind of thing to think about. Also ask yourself, what happened when you came in the door today? Did you feel especially welcomed? Or did something make you feel uncomfortable or surprised? And why would that be? Now, the second thing we ask you to do is use what you observe to make cross-cultural comparisons. So think about when you've collaborated on an art project, taught art to others, or given other artists constructive feedback, and how does that compare to what you're going to see today? Alternately, consider when you've experienced art with other spectators, whether it's been in a home, a theater, a gallery, a school, a temple, or wherever you might have been. How did the art connect you to the others there? If nothing else, was it something of an icebreaker, a point of commonality you could take for granted with the other people that chose to attend, and therefore something to talk about so that you could then find other points of commonality? Third, take the time to be aware that you're not just seeing or hearing things, but you interpret everything that you encounter based on your preconceived notions and ideas, and that this influences your understanding. So for one thing you want to think about when it comes to the idea of community is, how many of us think that our community ties are in some ways biological or natural? That they're in the blood, or according to modern science, the language of modern science, in our DNA. You want to consider the fact that within any one of the ethnic or racially based communities that we recognize in America, there's actually more genetic difference within that community than there is likely to be between two randomly selected people from two of the different communities. So really a great deal of the commonality we assume biologically among people within groups is really much more of a cultural belief that we have than a reality. And it's worth realizing that then ethnic and racial connections we feel and experience are really culturally constructed and made, built through the shared experience and the active passage of our heritage from generation to generation. And that's some of the process that we're going to learn about and see today. So approach your reflections on the program in these questioning ways as you're listening during the presentations, and even afterward when we're having discussion at the tables. Remember, you're the anthropologists. Presenters are going to give you an insider's perspective, what we call a first voice perspective. You're in the unique position of having an outsider's perspective, so it gives you a chance to see things differently, and so you want to keep an open mind as you're listening today. And then finally, once we're done with the presentations proper, we'll have a few minutes for questions from the floor, but then we're going to break for the buffet, and folks will get food. And what I would ask is that you wait until I come around and call your table. I'll go ahead and usher that. And while you're waiting to be called, and then after you've gotten food and you've had a few minutes to eat, we ask that you take the time to talk at your tables about what you learned in the program today and how that compares to your own experience. We have some facilitators today. If the facilitators could raise their hands. I think we got one at every table, and if not, we can probably distribute them, so we do. They'll help lead the conversation at your table, and there's also some guiding questions there as well. And then finally, we'll go around the room during the last 10 minutes and have folks share something from their table that they talked about. So thanks for coming out. We appreciate it, and I'm going to turn things back over to Tamara.
Oh, that's fine. As we were designing this presentation, we came together, all of us, several times around the table, and I was, in my role as moderator, I was listening to these two communities speak about some of the things they have in common, and I was impressed with that both groups suffered oppression that when it gets down to it, it really is quite similar. They both survived, resisted, and these two art forms are a way that they overcame and had a creative outlet in the face of some of those challenges. So I'm going to be asking our specialists, we have some new folks coming up to the podium. They're going to be telling us about the history of quilting in the African American community and the history of Irish music in the Irish community, of all things. And they're going to be touching on what brought people together, because initially it was not just to do this creative form, but they came together and the creative form was an outgrowth of that. And then we're going to get into the particulars of the things you see before us. These things that are not alive and these things that are alive over here are going to be highlighted for you. So I'm going to bring up here first Noel Rice. Noel is the president of the Irish American Heritage Center. He was born in Ireland several years ago, and he came to Chicago in the 1950s. He's been teaching music for more than 30 years, and he himself is a fluter. Is that the way you say it? He plays the flute, and he he's in a group called Baltina, which has something to do with the month of May. Is that what that means? The month of May, which is the beginning of the celebrations for summer. And he mentioned to me that he has a pleasure of playing in this group with some of the adult children that he's taught, just like these kids are here today. Maybe one day they'll stick with him and be part of his group. So, Noel, why don't you come on up?
To try and explain somehow how we all get into this playing Irish music and why, or if it's part of community. By the way, that Baltina, the band that we're in, I get to play with my own adult kids. That's the part that's satisfying. So after all these years of playing with my own kids, and of course by starting with them all those years ago, I started teaching other kids. And of course this is my latest group here. Hello. So, Anyway, the talking about community, in Ireland generally, we have, say before television and all that sort of thing, there were things called rambling houses. That's a rough way to describe it, is certain houses would welcome people to come visit and drop by and share the news, talk about what's going on in the community, even down to, you know, who's got cattle for sale or who's getting married or who just died over in the next county. And so in the process of drinking tea or whatever in the evening, that sometimes it would break out in a bit of a maybe some music or a song or whatnot. Now this didn't go on like all the time. You have rambling houses sometimes that you'd have people would come by almost every night. And I remember in our house we had a lady across the street, and Mrs. Duffy, and Mrs. Duffy would invariably come across the street and says, "It's only me." And she always said that she would arrive in always at dinner time, which was interesting, but she often sat down and would, of course, partake of whatever we were having. But the rambling houses, anyway, is sharing information. Oftentimes be there weeknights, like any time you drop in. And there was, I don't know if any of you that are very religious, but in Ireland they're mostly Catholic out in the countryside. But then oftentimes in the rambling houses, it was the younger ones of us would manage to try and figure out what time they were going to do the rosary so we could avoid it. And so, like in one place we used to go, Don Bolton, he was on to us, of course, and he would keep waiting until we'd show up. So if it was like 7 o'clock one night, we'd arrive in 7:30, and of course it was over. And so he would delay, and of course we usually got caught anyway. And so those are the things, little games that would go on. Anyway, that sometimes the music would get going and to be a marvelous evening. To take a big leap backwards into the, say, mid-1800s, when we had 2 bad scenes in Ireland with they call them the famine in the 40s, and there was something similar in the 20s. But huge immigration, roughly the half of the population left, and we wind up with leaving. And I hate to jump forward again quickly here, but in the modern times we have in Chicago, all the immigrants arriving, they would meet, instead of at their homes or apartments, they would wind up meeting at the common place, would be like Irish pubs, and that the Irish pub became the social center, and that's where, of course, in actual fact, this wound up becoming reflected backwards into Ireland. There was no great sessions of music in Ireland in the pubs until it started with the immigrants after the Second World War in England and in America, oddly enough. So we wind up with huge sessions and meetings in pubs, and the rooms downstairs and upstairs became the meeting rooms, and of course we'd play for hours. A meeting at 3 o'clock, and you get home 3 o'clock in the morning. You know, it was great fun. I mean, I don't think I could do it now, but that were those days, them days, you know, that were so good. I don't know whether we should. What else you want to do here? Play some music or something? Okay. Well, okay.
You're welcome to dance. You don't have to. Okay, so thank you, Noel. And now we're going to be asking Pat Bearden to come up. Pat is a former Chicago public school teacher and a Golden Apple winner. She's is a Mellon Fellow at the University of Chicago and studied methods for integrating cultural literacy across the curriculum, and has written an award-winning book on the topic. Recipient of several awards, and now finds herself advocating for family history in schools and communities nationwide.
Good afternoon, everyone. How's everybody doing? Okay. Well, I'm going to tell you about a little bit about our organization and how I got involved in the quilts. And naturally, it's a story. How many minutes do I have, Mario? 10 whole minutes? Okay. Okay, we're going to work this out. Okay, a part of the organization I belong to is called the Sons and Daughters of Slave Ancestry, because as a teacher, I found that and teaching on the South Side that a lot of our children didn't know the heritage or anything. And I didn't know mine until I was 50, which happened about 2 years ago. I was about 50 about 2 years ago. Okay, that's a joke. Okay. But so we got together. I started doing research and found out about my ancestors and got so excited. And I said, why can't kids do this too? And we started an organization after I got all this rich information on my slave heritage. And I said, what are we going to do with this? And so we started an organization called the Sons and Daughters of Slave Ancestry on the south side of Chicago. And it's international. Anyone who can connect with a slave ancestor can join our little group. So we have a philosophy in which I will read to you and interject some things that we are proud of our enslaved ancestors, not ashamed. And a lot of us are. Want to remember the past. A lot of people don't want to remember the past. Not erase it. Want to celebrate our heritage, not mourn it. A lot of people want to be victims. We are victorious. Our ancestors were victorious, and that's across cultures. And want to promote a dialogue about this chapter in world history for the purpose of documenting and preserving slave genealogy for future generations. So one way that we decided to do this was to get a culture preservation project going across the nation. And we asked that people who that had pictures of their ancestors who were former slaves submit them to us, just copies. And we would use these pictures and oral histories and names and put them on quilts so that we could see exactly how these ancestors look and honor them for what they did, their contributions, and also to model in the community and let kids see that we are proud of our ancestors and that we want to remember them. And so by getting them out and sharing them and talking about who they were and what they did and how they navigated their way to freedom, it gets you going, And I certainly wish that I had had these pictures when I was a kid, because when I studied history, and Mario was talking about studying history, I just memorized and did what I had to do. No connection. And now history just comes alive, and that's what we're trying to do, is make history come alive, making personal connections to learning, and that's across cultures, because we all have stories, we all have families, and we all come from somewhere. So someone said we have to be the change we want to see. So we decided that, hey, we're going to do something. We are going to do this cultural preservation project. We have over 350 quilts. I'm sorry, photos of former slaves who experienced freedom, and we're putting them on quilts. And then as they came alive to us, we saw we had certain themes going on. And some of the themes, one, is it time to talk about the quilts? Okay. One of the things, okay, I'll do this. One of the quilts that we put together, and talking about building community, it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a community and a village to put these quilts together, because everybody has a part in putting the quilts together. The members, and you don't have to be a member, you just turn in a picture. And hopefully, and a pedigree chart show us how you're connected to a slave ancestor. And we try to verify that in our office, okay? And so we're documenting, we're always doing the research, higher order thinking, historical thinking going on. This is the Chicago migration quilt. Many people after slavery migrated to Chicago. And we have 16 pictures up here. And one, I want to tell you a story about, there's Father Toten. I don't know if you're familiar with Father Toten, the first black priest in the United States. 2 weeks ago, a month ago, Sabrina Penn, his great-great-niece, came in and submitted a picture with the story. Okay, he's a runaway slave. He was 7 years old when he ran away with his mother and his sister. And then there's a picture up here of William Jones. And so we can make stories and thematic, make history come alive through stories. And this is what we're trying to do. He was an orderly for General Sherman. What's his name? General Sherman in the Civil War. And there, I got to talk about my great-great-grandmother. I submitted a picture. Thank you very much. And there she is, Julia Snowden. This gentleman, she lived to be 100 years old. And all of these folks came to Chicago in search of a better life. And how did they get made? They got made with cooperation from members who shared our vision, shared what we wanted to do. And God knows, where's Kathy? Who's Kathy, when she came to talk about the Irish, Kathy, there you are. Stereotypes, misperceptions about our people and how they looked and how they lived and what they did. And our goal is to share with the world community positive images of the Black family and its traditions. And we do everything everyone else does. And as I listened to each one that came up talk about holding on to the heritage, that's what we're trying to do in our community. And we all have similar problems, but how do we do that? And a lot of people are ashamed of their heritage, or they don't want to remember, they're so busy surviving. But we have all these stories, and people are dying, and they're getting older. Let me find the person I want to talk about. There's Johnny Lee, one of our members, is the son of a slave. He would not admit that his father was a slave until he heard he's 80 now, and he has Alzheimer's. And he came to our office with the picture, and he was so glad that there was an organization that uplifted his father. His father. So we don't know how people are hurting nowadays because of the way people perceive our people. And it's really, let me move on to the next quilt, okay, because I can talk forever. When are you gonna raise that? Okay. How many raise it up? 2 minutes, okay. Okay, and this is a wonderful quilt that was just made, and this is the abolitionist quilt. We had about 14 pictures that we wanted to put on the quilt, and what we found out that all these people on the quilt, including the slaves, were abolitionists. So we can talk about the story. History is is not the most topic taught in the schools. And we're trying to find a way to talk about slavery in a way that dignifies us and dignifies the teacher and the children and the students, so that when they hear about this episode in history, that they won't put their heads down and feel ashamed. So if we can start with the pictures of our people, how they looked after slavery, and tell some positive stories about how they navigated their way through life, and they didn't give up, because that's why we're here today. And so that's the kind of message we want to send, and tell the other story. Yeah, it's economic. It was economic, and it's the way you have to think about it in the context of the times. The other picture, other quilt here, is the Underground Railroad quilt, and this is a quilt code showing all the ways that the slaves navigated their way to freedom. See, right here, you can come up here when you get a chance. The Drunken Path, the Monkey Wrench, signal for slaves to collect tools for what they needed for their journey. Log cabin indicated that a specific log cabin was a safe house. The North Star, rail fence has a secret code with pattern. Then the shoe fly represents a person who would aid and harbor fugitives. So you can come up here and look. Wrap it up. Okay, so Did I cover everything? Okay, I hope that you understand. Oh, this one. I got it. Okay, I'm on. Okay, I brought this quilt as a symbol to color them human. We did this quilt with in color to share with you, and these are people from all across the nation. And these are all former slaves, every one of them. This little boy right here, picture was taken in slavery. It's on a tintype. I wanted also, this gentleman right here, the submitter is right in the room. Would you hold your hand up, please? Christopher Reed. Who is that, your great-grandfather? Double great-grandfather, and that's what we're talking about. And we need to do more of that and getting people to get involved in doing this process, and thank you very much.
Okay, Pat, thank you so much. I can tell that you are very passionate about this, and there'll be time to talk to Pat a little bit more afterwards. And Noel, now is your time to come up and introduce your musicians here, so you guys can wake up now.
Thank you. I forgot to mention like how with this music and as part of the culture or part of community, it's amazing like when, like even today in Chicago, for instance, these kids, if they want to go to New York, they can get 20, 30, 40 phone numbers of people to visit to play music. They can go like tomorrow and they play tomorrow night. California, anywhere, any of the big cities in America, they can do that. Irish music has taken over, I think. But what we do, we practice at the Irish Heritage Center, Irish American Heritage Center, and we're there since it opened. It was an old school building that was in disrepair. We bought it for $502,000. The 3 bids, we got it because we didn't like even numbers according to the story. And we meet up there every week. I like to get kids who can play so that I can teach them the Irish style, a way of playing. But in the process of doing that, I'm hoping to try and keep the kids interested in play this old music with a little twist. So I try to get them to, say, add their little piece to it, or like say, what should we play next, or how should we start this new piece if we're building a piece? Try and get their input. So one of the pieces you've heard of river dance, right? The big dance. I'm not going to dance, but part of the music was done by people like Mike Whalen and Donald Lunny, and about 10 years prior to Riverdance, they had done an interlude for the Eurovision Song Contest, and it was a piece that called Time Dance, and we can play a little bit of that, can't we? Now, you can hear a lot of modern elements in that, but it's like start off as a kind of a slip jig, which is 9/8, and you can count it like 3s and 3, 1 2 3 2 to 3 3 3, or 1 2 3, or if you're of a mind, 1 2 3 1, like a waltz. Anyway, we love playing this music. The kids are terrific. You want to play something else since you have a moment here? Like we invent these little pieces and to try and get them their input.
I'm wondering if Noel asked one of you to say something.
Kira was dying to talk.
Are you Kira? Yeah? Okay. Okay. We're going to ask Kira to tell us how she got started with Noel in this genre of music, and actually if you had music background before that, and what this means to you.
Hi. I started playing at the Academy of Irish Music about 11 years ago when I was 7. And I didn't really have any classical background. I started off in an orchestra at school, and then I came to Irish music. And what I really enjoy about this is that you can put your own ideas and creativity into it. And that was one thing that I found personally that you couldn't do in orchestra at school. You know, you had to play exactly what was on the sheet, you know, same bowing and everything like that. And, you know, here, you know, you get to go beyond the notes on the tune and stuff like that. And I just think it's great. And the best thing about it is that we all get along. You know, it's more than just, you know, sitting around and playing tunes. We get to talk to each other. You know, we have laugh, you know, and everything like that. And even when we play together, we still communicate with each other through the music. I mean, we know what we're going to be playing next. We know each other's styles and everything like that. And, you know, just get along great. So it's just, you know, another family to be with and everything. So I don't know what to say about it. Thanks.
Thanks, Kira. I think that's really fascinating because I think it is the young, modern Chicago version of what Noel was talking about, that coalescing of community. So that's perfect. Do you want to say anything to wrap it up? Or? Yeah,
And the music itself is like, it becomes its own attraction after a while. It's like, becomes an addiction, and you have to play it. You love to hear it. You hear tunes running around in your head. The last tune was a tune I put together because I just needed something for a piece we were doing, so it seemed to fit so well. What they didn't play, of course, was that out of that we were supposed to go into a very hard driving jig out of that, like bop bop, you know, make it really drive. Anyway, we love playing this music. We love inviting kids. My nightmare, of course, is a very sincere mother showing up with a 13-year-old boy who never played. I mean, I don't think I could handle it. It's just too much. I need kids that can play something, or that are willing to play, or have some background or something going on in school. The numbers are horrible when you think of the dropout rate of 95%. I'm hoping to get to 5. God, it would be nice to people that are already committed, they have something going, family discipline, they know where to rent an instrument. Oh, how nice, you know. Then I can show them how to play Irish music. Is that enough?
Is that enough? I think. Thank you. Okay, next we're going back to the quilters, and I'm going to
Try and
ask Sherry
explain
to come back up
how
and give us.
we all get into this
I actually
playing
got the
Irish
order
music and
a
why,
little
or if
wrong
it's
and put
part
Pat
of
on the
community.
spot and came up to talk about the specific
by the
before I
way,
give
that,
Sherry a chance to do the
Valtina,
general. So
the
she's going to
band
give
that
us a little
we're in,
history about quilting in the
I get
African
to go
American
to
community.
my own adult kids. That's the part that's satisfying. So after all
Quilts
these years
have been
of
the
playing
center of just really everything in the African American community. Quilts are cherished so to the point that I have 2 quilts my mom made for me that I put up because I didn't want anyone to use them, and they're in my house somewhere and I can't find them. But they just show how valuable, they're just more valuable than gold to just anyone who's ever had an opportunity to receive one as a gift, to even touch one or sleep underneath one. Bear with me. Don't have my glasses on. Okay. I wanted to just share with you guys that Thank you, Pat. So often we take for granted the right to choose where we can live and where we can play and where we can go. And one of the things that have been central in the use of the quilt has been its enormous use for coalition building. My mom I never saw her, and I keep referring to her because I'm not a quilter. And one of the things that I do understand is that my mother always worked and still does always work. Before the invention of widespread use of birth control pill and women going into the workforce, the quilt was used as a way to supplement family income. It was used as a way to put together those scraps of old clothing that you may have had lying around, and you would put the quilt together to represent family members. My mom made a quilt 30 years ago of the most ugly maternity coat that I wore. It was a vibrant orange with stripes, and I don't know if she was trying to just honor the fact that I was having the first child in the family in the last 25 years, or was it to just remind me of how crazy this coat was that I wore. I gained 120 pounds, so you can imagine how big the coat was. But with that quilt, I'm so often reminded of the beautiful experience of bringing my daughter Asia into the world. And so quilts represent that wonderful experience of life, of inspiration, of love. And the quilt that I'd like to point out today is one that gave great inspiration to me just of recent. And it's a quilt that was made by a community member. And the beautiful lady who made this quilt is sitting here at the table next to my mom. And I'd like for her to stand if she can. It's the Miss Lula Scott. Thank you, Ms. Scott, so much. The Afghan that she that she designed and made is the one that's draped here to your right, my left. Again, these are experiences in handiwork that have been passed down through the generations. She makes quilts as well. Unfortunately, wasn't able to con her out of a quilt just yet, but we definitely, but I do appreciate her sharing with us the beautiful handiwork that was passed through the generations through her skilled hands. So quilts, again, are used for passing heritage as well. Over quilts, we often tell stories of our heritage, and in my family, of course, this was an experience that is very, very dear to my heart. Before the internet and before research and before widespread family history research, I managed to overhear women who were quilting talk about how they would resolve issues in families, how they would prepare recipes that failed, how they could make a meal out of flour and water. There were many conversations that went over the building and the construction of quilts. And so while we see the end result is a beautiful creation, a beautiful art piece, a beautiful expression of love, of inspiration, of hardship, I know that so many of the quilts that my mom has been made over tears of joy and of hardship. And I'd like to, briefly reflect on how I've managed to just manipulate my mother into quilting. There some years ago, when they were tearing down Robert Taylor housing, I had shared with my mom that there were women who had wanted to do some coalition building, and that we thought central to their getting together, a quilt would be an ideal way to start conversations. And so my mom gave me a list of all the wonderful things we needed to buy, the thread, the materials, and I went out and I made the kits for each one of the ladies who were going to participate in the class. Well, we all showed up to start beginning conversations of coalition building. Many of these women were facing homelessness. And so when my mom looked around the room, she said, well, who's going to teach the class? I said, you are. So I managed to maneuver my mom's great skills in not only coalition building, but her artistic expressions that she's made through quilts. And so Pat was able to share with us the earlier history of quilts in the African American history, that being signals for the Underground Railroad, that being a way to keep warm. using the scraps of clothing and putting them together for warmth. Also putting the quilts together to supplement income. But I'm here to stand today to say that quilts are now being used as a way to document the African American experience, whether it be slavery, whether it be the birth of a new child, or whether it be a way to just show that I have skills. And I thank you.
Okay, we're going to take this microphone actually to Sherry's mother, Doris Davis, because she's kind of trapped over here. But she's going to tell us when she started quilting, who she learned from, what she's learned along the way in her years of doing this.
I started quilting about, I don't know, 30 years ago, I guess. I tried to learn. The first person that tried to teach me was a perfectionist. And so the first quilt I made was for Angel's first child. And it took me a whole 9 months to make it. But I have a problem measuring. So I've been in a couple of quilting classes, and that didn't work. I don't use tape measures or anything. I just look at it and cut it and tear it. And, you know, that's how I quilt. I have a problem measuring things. I make them my way. All my quilts are made my way. Thank you.
I'm going to ask you one more question, though. When you're quilting, tell us about working with a group. Do you do that with a group, or do you mostly do it on your own?
I only do it with a group unless Sherry tricked me. Fortunately, the people that was in the quilting class, they couldn't quilt at all. Matter of fact, some of them couldn't see. But it was really, it was therapy for us and for them. But I'll teach my way. If they want to learn that way, I'll teach them that way. And if they want to measure, they can measure. Not me.
Okay, thank you, Miss Davis. All right, so the last thing that we're going to talk about, and I'm going to have to ask all these people to come up one more time, is the challenges to the continuity of this cultural expression. Noel, why don't you come on up and give us your insight into...
The difficulty when communities are, say, doing well in the, well, let me back up a bit. When we came here as, say, immigrants, first you need to get a job. You gather together to try and help each other. That's where you meet. We used to have these, I know it sounds funny in a way, these endless meetings and fun and games, but there was an under practical side to all of this. It was making connections, getting jobs, getting who's looking, whatnot. A recent survey, or well, I think it was maybe more than 10 years ago, I don't know, that because of the say the nuns and priests who came out with the immigrants here to Chicago all those years, they were well prepared for, you might recall, the GI Bill when it came around in the 40s after the Second World War, and they wound up becoming the most successful ethnic group in America, both from an educational point of view and a dollars earned point of view. Now, that sounds great, except that coming with that is like you have no longer living in the inner city, you wind up going off to the suburbs, and so how do you get the soccer moms to jump in the SUV, drive down to the Heritage Center and spend 3 hours or 2 hours, or, well, we're there 12 to 4, spend 4 hours, knitting in the hallway, quilting maybe in the hallway, and waiting for the kid to get the lesson. It just doesn't quite make too much sense. Most of the kids today now are so overscheduled that we can't get, like we used to get 2 and 3 practices a week with some of the older kids that we managed to bring up their playing skills. Now I get just Saturdays. I don't get any week because the kids just don't have the time. They're doing everything and anything. So how do you, never mind the fact that we have tens of thousands of kids out there that we never hear, never reach, can't even find, and then sometimes it's so infuriating. Years later you hear someone say, oh, I've always wanted to play Irish music, but I couldn't find it. Maybe you should come and visit us and take part in this and learn something about it, and we keep it all from dying out. Well, there's the danger of most of the ethnic groups right now is that they have declining membership because whatever the immigrants say after the war, that bulge is over. Europe is doing very well. We even have, in the Irish case, we have people returning now to Ireland. Of, say, the 45,000 new immigrants to Ireland in a year, something around 13 or 14,000 of them are returning immigrants. So some of them, of course, are leaving us from Chicago. So with that, where is the way of keeping it all together? It's impossible. So the things are changing, we're changing, and so now we become a minor, within the Irish community, we become a minor effort instead of like a major effort. We have regular middle class America is dominating the thoughts and actions of our middle class successful brethren, and the orchestra may be more important, or accounting maybe. Never mind having a few tunes while you're able to do your accounting. You know, some of our great people we know, that's, what was his name in Africa? That was the great expert on Bach. People like Bill Clinton could play the sax. Nixon played the piano. You know, from a cultural point of view or from a liberal arts point of view, it's no burden to learn to play. And if you're going to play, why not have a little of your own cultural background as well? How's that? Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that summing up. And Pat, I think you're on next. And her question is just a little bit different. I'd like Pat to tell us how these heritage quilts are meeting a community need.
One of the goals of the exhibit, Former Slaves and Freedom, a visual history, is to take the quilts on the road and show them and share them with the school community, libraries, educational institutions, to make people more informed and more aware of who our people were. So it's about enlightening them and exposing them this new information that we have gathered from the descendants of slaves who have shared these stories from generation to generation. And now they have a vehicle to use to put it out into the universe so that maybe you'll be more informed. I know I certainly have been more informed as a result of turning in my pictures. And then we made up the next rule is everybody has to write a story, and then you have to write about it. And then you have to connect it to history, because it's all about how you fit into the world. And maybe it'll help by looking at these pictures, you'll have another way of looking at the world. And you know, when you teach history, it's very abstract and cold. And by humanizing this time period in history, you get a better idea that they were Africans who came to America and enslaved, and that they had the same feelings and desires as everyone else did, and that they went on to live their lives after slavery, building schools, and one is a millionaire over there. I can't point him out right now. And even found out that even the church had slaves. The one in the corner right down there was owned by the Catholic Church. And how did that fit into the scheme of things? So we're talking about making informed decisions, being informed about all the stories. And the only way that that can happen is that we can get our people to share the stories, and then you can make up your mind what happened and what didn't happen. And you'll be more attuned to the world that we live in versus what we read in the history books. So it's a supplementation of the information that we gather in the schools, and it's so rigid and it has to be this way. I think Galileo's father used to ask his son when he came home from school, he said, "Did you learn something today or did you simply believe?" So we're so busy just believing. They said this, they said that, but how can we do our own research and ask questions in a thoughtful manner so that we will not just simply believe? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pat. Okay, now throughout all these presentations, I'm sure some questions have passed through your mind. So is there anybody here who wants to pose a question to one of our presenters?
I'm totally amazed with the way the slaves were able to make this life, and I just wondered, was everything, I know, like in the Holocaust, everything was taken away from them. Did they have property, or were they able to keep whatever they had, the slaves? Because I can't figure out how they were able to come out of that and be so successful.
One thing I didn't get a chance to talk about was the different levels and different classes of people who came out of slavery. I had brought a picture, okay, of one of our slave ancestors that was submitted, and she's gorgeous. Here she is. So it just depends. See this? This is a former slave in freedom. So we have these compelling pictures to show the different stories that came out of slavery. Everyone was not poor. Most of them were. Some of them, if you look at the 1870 census, you will find that they had property. And some of them were laborers, like my great-great-grandfather, Emmons, a sharecropper. So they're varied stories, and we have the stories too. So the thing is to share the different stories to be more informed. No, see, you can't say that. That's an absolute statement. No, we can't do that.
Okay.
What? Oh. All of these pictures are after slavery because
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to the next question.
I'll rephrase the question.
Is that unclear to you that,
Okay, we need a question.
The way she's dressed, it looks like she's pretty well off. I just wondered, did that come to her after slavery, that she was able to be so successful and get the money, or?
Well,
What I mean?
she died very young. She was 38 when she died. But some were more affluent based on the relationship with the slaveholder. Some slaveholders gave them land.
Oh, okay.
They got land for the government. This is Christopher Reed from Roosevelt University, Professor Christopher Reed, historian. So, yeah, so the stories are varied, and that's what we're trying to say, that every story is not the same. All our stories are different and need to be heard.
It's amazing to me what the people now that are descendants of the slaves, how well they've done. And I mean, I give you guys so much credit. And I remember I saw that play about the two African-American women that were in their hundreds.
Oh, having our say.
Yes.
Having
it
our
was
say.
fantastic. And they were descendants of slaves.
Right.
One was a teacher.
Well,
one
we're
was a
human
nurse.
beings.
Right.
If you got opportunity, all of us can do well. It's opportunity and skill and talent and motivation to do well. That's any group.
All right,
That's across cultures.
Yeah, it's very interesting that she would think that the slaves had so much because most of them left with the shirt on their back.
Right, that's right.
And that's why so many of them returned to slavery, because they had nowhere to stay, nothing to eat, nowhere to go.
So you have a story.
Yeah, and isn't it true that many of the lynchings were because of the affluent blacks that they wanted to destroy because they had so much wealth? And, you know, when they destroyed the Black Wall Street, I mean, that's where...
That was in the 1920s.
Yeah, but the slaves didn't have anything.
Right.
You know, that it seemed like almost every other group that has been enslaved has been gotten reparations. The Jews, when they left Pharaoh, they borrowed gold, everything that they should have gotten while they were in slavery. The Pharaoh, people were glad to give it to them because they had destroyed their firstborn. So they gave them everything they asked for. And they had so much gold that they could make a golden calf, you know. And then the Japanese, they got reparations. So many other races have gotten reparations, but blacks haven't gotten anything, you know. And that's where a lot of the lynchings came from. You know, they destroyed the blacks that were affluent or, you know, of some sort of esteem that could help their race. They wouldn't allow them to learn, to go to school, to do anything. It was like institutionalized to keep them down.
Well, this is why in our philosophy we talk about a lot of things are hurtful, but they have to be said and dialogued about, and then you move on as best you can, because our kids, if you stay in that level, then they kind of don't want to talk about it. They want to feel bad, but our thing is to talk about our people who made it because we made it. That's why we're here. Okay? So there are a lot of issues. Your point is well taken. That's it's history. It's history. It's history, and we got to deal with it.
Okay, here's a question here.
I was wanting to address Noel. I'm curious, at the Celtic Fest last summer, there were many representatives of people of, I guess you could say, Celtic extraction from many parts of Europe. And I'm just curious if the resurgence of Irish music is creating a Celtic community across different national boundaries.
It'd be nice to say that, but in each of these countries, they have their own energy and their own push to do things. The early success of the Irish music, primarily with people like Chieftains, Bothy Planxty, in the 70s, brought a lot of others, like to create performing bands, like the Scottish Galicians, and primarily, like, they were very good. They had lots of huge, like, background of music and tons of people playing, but then came forward with their performance bands. So at Celtic Fest, what we try to do down there is to bring bands from all of these countries and to kind of represent, like, a Celtic idea, or the remnants, the northwest remnants of Europe, like where the Celtic people, or Celtic traditions, you could call them, and even some don't even like using that because it's too general. It's more like a marketing idea than it is real.
And Noel, I just want to interject here to have you maybe elaborate on something that may be a misperception. Are your students Irish American, or are they of different heritage?
I don't know. Well, usually we have a mix. I don't really care when they come looking for the music. They'll get it. So we have something odd. We have some Irish here, right? Irish? 2 parents born in Ireland. 3 of them, their parents were born in Ireland. Eric? See? Taylor? Yeah? Dan? Oh, no. Oh, he's got a half and half, right? Yeah. We argue about the Italian side of his family all the time. I keep telling him about the influence of Corelli and Vivaldi in some of our blind harpers in the early 1700s, and he likes that.
One more question.
Okay, I think we have time for one more.
I was just wondering if both groups might speak to something I'm a little bit curious about, which is kind of the side effects or the process of creating the art. I mean, the music is beautiful and the quilts are amazing, but I'm curious to learn more about perhaps maybe something that might happen at a quilting bee, or maybe the process of kids maybe learning to work together, kind of, I guess, the side effect of the art process as opposed to, or the process of creating art as opposed to the end result. I would like to hear a little bit more about that on both sides.
Spoken like a true anthropologist.
So I should have said, what? Lots of research on the idea that music and verbal skills seem to go hand in hand because of where it is, comes through the brain. Don't ask me to explain it, I don't know. But generally, people with musical backgrounds tend to do well on, I'm not sure why, but we can suggest that maybe it's the idea that when you're playing something now, your mind really actually does extend to the next tune and the next tune, and you tend to think in terms of a piece rather than the notes you're now playing. So you know where you are in the piece. So if you're to design a piece of software, for instance, instead of thinking about the piece you're working on now, you see where it fits into the system. Maybe that has some, I'm only suggesting this, I'm no expert on it, but when we play, we also compete in competitions, and we tend to lead the success of this type of music. And of course, some of our brethren don't like it, they don't understand it, they don't emulate it. So we get nothing but barbs, strikes, stones, sticks. But my primary interest is that I came from an attitude of, say, playing solid core heart jigs and reels, and when you go play in a mixed audience, they don't listen. So we have to devise the music in such a way that we still give tons of reels and jigs, but we present it in a kind of a contemporary way, and the people actually listen. So to the general audience, it sounds familiar. To the tradders, it sounds like, why don't they play more tunes? So we get that kind of complaint. But as you can hear, this sounds good. I like it. This is, I think, the way we should be going in the future. The success of the Irish bands mainly is not playing ceilidh dance music, but playing arranged music, so it's for the listeners. It's listening music. If you want to stamp your feet, you can, but...
Okay, Sherry, I'm going to ask you to answer that question about the side effect of making the quilt on the community.
Firstly, when I think of quilts, I think about when they are begun by inspiration. Whether there is an inspiration to develop a piece to keep someone warm, to construct a quilt that would represent the heritage of the family, having pieces of cloth that were parts of garments that the elders wore, or you wore, or I wore. And so I would say inspiration is probably what triggers the construction of quilts. But I'd like for Lula Scott, if she could, make some remarks about when she started quilting and what inspired her to continue to quilt.
I started making quilts before I had kids.
Okay.
My grandma, before she died, she was 112. And we couldn't throw nothing away. And it was just two of us was crippled, me and my other cousin. And they throw us one side. My grandfather and aunt said, I show you, you don't have to ask nobody to do stuff. That's what I do. If y'all would saw my quilt, y'all would know which one to take. I got 6 different quilts. But the pillows, I got so many different sizes, the postman didn't know what kind he wanted. Is I'm right or wrong? He went up there and saw that stuff, he didn't know which one. He said, I take that one. And the only way he took that because he forgot it, and I caught him. He said, don't you, stop out. Over here, just want you to take your money. That's how you got that quilt.
All right. So we see this great pride in what people do with their talents and the things that they make. And part of that is displaying and showing and sharing. Okay, folks, we're going to go ahead and do our sharing around the room now before we go. So we're going to start with this table. They're going to share us a little bit of what they talked about in their conversation.
Okay. We were really focused on the city kind of urban issues and talking about kind of the comparison of going back to Ireland and the kind of cross Atlantic versus a lot of African Americans going back to the South, and what are some of the advantages of that. And we talked a lot about just kind of discussing the projects and pros and cons of the changes in the projects and whether that was advantageous or just kind of the complexities of that. And we're talking about things like the city, schools, and having programs for students to learn how to bank, kind of practical things like that, and kind of just basic concerns about our community and all the real serious things that we've all been living through in these times.
And just to get very specific, did anybody share, say, reasons that contemporary African Americans would be going back to the South now? And maybe like what maybe one of those things would be?
Well, the economics was very impressive. And did one of you gentlemen want to give some of the facts on that?
Well, one of the reasons a lot of African Americans are going back home because of their economics, the value of their dollar stretches even further. They sell their house in the north, they go back to the south and have a house built, and they're able to live on the income, plus the house is already paid for, and it's a lot less stressful. I think my great uncle said it best. I'm trying to get away from the rest of y'all. But it's, well, it's, as Joe was saying, that, you know, down south now, you have more integrated couples in the south than you do the north because it's a lot more easier to live down there. A lot of things are more acceptable as opposed to all the rules and guidelines here in the north.
All right, great, thank you. Then we'll come back here.
We talked about quite a few different things. One of the striking things for me was, or what I personally like about the quilts, is that they literally keep people warm and they keep the community warm in a symbolic way. But that's just a personal idea I had. And then we had another nice example in the group about quilts being used as maps, indicating slaves who were planning to run away, where they could go and how they could go, which now that we have the maps exhibits in the Field Museum would probably have been a beautiful example to have in there as well. And then we had a lot of interest in the group towards each other's traditions. And this gentleman sitting next to me from the Bronzeville Historical Society, he was particularly interested in Irish music and from Irish music getting into food. So I would like to ask him to share his experience with us.
Hello again, my name is Mark. I'm affiliated with the Bronzeville Historical Society. My interest was in the Irish music because I am also a musician by life. My father was a minister. I played in the band, an orchestra in high school, and marched in the marching band. So I was particularly interested in the music, and I was interested in how he mentioned how they would have a house where the people would come together and mingle. And I was telling them that was a symbol of the community coming together, just as the quilts were a symbol of our heritage coming together as well. And we have so much in common. And basically what we sat down and we talked about the things that we noticed about each particular culture and how we all went through our own strives in life and how we've overcame them. And we had a pretty good conversation over here. I'm really enjoying it.
Okay, coming over here.
There are two different, well, we talked a wide range of things, but one of the things I wanted to share was we came up with the idea of many definitions of community. The notion of the making the quilts together. Some of the cultures actually create community in the process of making the quilts, and they may make a quilt and then give it to one family, make another quilt, give it to another, and so forth. Others talked about making quilts or doing something as a very individual endeavor, and primarily for keeping warm, but the sharing of the story of the making of the quilt to keep warm then becomes part of building community and so forth. So there are a lot of different ways we decided to talk about how an art form creates community if we define community differentially. And then Andrew wanted to share something.
Yeah, following along those lines in our discussion of community, we found that many neighborhoods today are no longer divided primarily by ethnic background, that many people who are Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, Irish Americans are settled throughout the Chicagoland area. So many groups that initially began perhaps like the Irish musical group are now attracting people from the neighborhood and also people from different ethnic backgrounds who just have an interest in this. So we're fostering community now along lines other than just ethnic heritage. And that's an interesting phenomena that's developing quite recently. Thank you.
Just to comment on that, though, I would assume it probably is true that, as Noel was saying, the end of the period of immigration and the assimilation of people, that there's more sort of mixing among groups and the mixing of neighborhoods, that people are drawn to different kinds of music and get involved in that. But certainly there's a long tradition of people taking, like musicologists and professional musicians and things, taking interest in one another's musical traditions and exploring those to some extent. Anyone here?
Our kickoff point was the fact that the Bronzeville group was promoting understanding how coming out of slavery was an achievement and that the people survived, and the cultural ramifications of that. And consequently, we also spoke about how other immigrant groups like the Irish and the Mexicans came to the United States, and even though they weren't specifically enslaved within the United States, that they were discriminated against and formed their own communities which promoted their own culture also. Also, we saw quilting as a social activity and, interestingly enough, a form of therapy when most of the time, women, though my grandfather quilted, got together and talked amongst themselves. It was also a method of survival, as was said at the other table. Not only did people quilt just to get together, but you slept under that quilt. And usually if you were a poor family, I'll add that, probably 4 or 5 other people slept under that quilt with you. So you needed quilts to survive. We also spoke about music as being a universal language that even appeals to babies, and that music is not only made for the people who make the music, but it is usually made also for some other people, and many times not just for the community itself, but for the people outside the community. And, okay, I guess that's about it.
Okay, anyone from this table?
We talked about how art is the great equalizer, that it can overcome stratification in different socioeconomic groups and bring people together. And we were especially impressed at how making quilts or music didn't require you to follow rigid rules, but you didn't have to measure. You could just eyeball it and create this piece of work. And the same with the music. You could go beyond the notes that were written on the page. And one of the reasons we felt this was possible is because creating art is a very personal activity, and it lowers your barriers, and so that you're more willing to share. It encourages the sharing, the exchanging of knowledge and skills and ideas, and to create something that's bigger. It's than just one person. It's the situation where the sum equals more than the whole, than the individual parts. And one of our participants was a composer, and she shared with us how if she created a piece of music and it just sat on the shelf, it would be something different than what happens to that piece of music when she shares it with the musicians and they polish it for the performance. It becomes different and larger than just the creation of one individual. And then once they're performing it, the audience becomes involved and they interpret the music, and it becomes even greater than when just the composer and the musicians were together. So an entire community is created to interpret that piece of art, which I hadn't really thought of it that way. So I thought it's just amazing how art can bring people together.
In our table, we talked about the feeling of shame, and we learned that throughout our different cultural backgrounds, Mexican, Polish, Italian, we all have experienced shame, or our ancestors have, and we determined that the closer we are to an oppressive experience, the more hesitant we're going to be to openly talk about it. And so we thought that was interesting.
And I think also interesting that, you know, in a sense that's, and you were picking right up on part of the theme of today, is that then the artwork and the sharing that becomes a way to overcome that and get a voice.
We also talked a little bit about how art is, how art preserves the reality and reflects the, how art preserves and reflects the reality of people's experiences. And we had said also that, like, you know, they were preserving their pride, and they showed their pride, and they were preserving their heritage through the music and through the quilting. But we also said that we were talking about that quilting may not necessarily be a ownership, a black ownership, but that there was someone in the group that also, she's French, and she said that her grandmother also quilted. And someone else mentioned that the Hmong people also, when they came from the refugees, they also created quilts to tell their history, their stories. So there was some similarities there, connections there. And one of the comments that was made is that seeing the images in the quilts made history, seeing the photos made history very real and human. So that was interesting to see the images in the quilts. But one of the things that happened too is that we were talking and we said that communities, no matter what community, they're multi-layered, they're multifaceted. And although you're part of that community, there's diversity that exists within each community, and that you may not be experiencing the same, you know, having the same history as that group. So we were just talking about how multifaceted and how diverse we are, that we can learn from each other, though. It's not a bad thing, it's a good thing, because we can get a greater picture, a more real picture of the greater story.
One of the things that we talked about at our table was art, and specifically music, and how it brings community together. And what we were talking about mainly was contemporary music. Does it make you feel part of a community? And does it make you feel excluded? And one of the interesting points here is Velma at our table, who's born in 1933, and has had the privilege of living through many different types of forms of music: jazz, blues, soul, I mean, lots of different variations of music. Very much felt the connection and felt part of the hip-hop community, which is a fairly recent music genre. And so we found that very interesting that she felt part of that community. The further interesting was that she mentioned her younger grandchildren were accepting of this and said, grandma's cool, grandma's part of our hip-hop community, and everything's all right. But as the children progressed in age, and like 13, 14 years old, they said, grandma no longer can be in our hip-hop community. And so it was interesting that it forms community, but it also is a point of differentiation as well. And it's, to support individuality and differentiation. So it works both ways.
our discussion really focused on the nature of hands-on projects and how they form groups and kind of form community, which in turn facilitate learning both in schools and outside of the classroom. And we found that really the heart of this facilitation was that it allowed for and encourages peer collaboration, whether it's in the classroom or outside of the classroom, and whether it's in math or whether it's in learning music. And one of the quotes that I really liked was how important it is to reintroduce it back into the classroom, this kind of peer teaching and peer review, because if you can teach it, you can learn it.
Our focus was pretty much on that statement number 3. We found that many of us here at the table are educators in some form or another. We're either have been in the schools or we're in the schools now. But we came up with 3 stories for you. One talks about sharing lunch. And one of the people at the table said that she learned about art and the connecting of art by sharing lunch at her school. She was with a young Chinese student, and the two of them looked over and said, I see what you have, you see what I have, I like what you have, let's share it. And in the process, they got to know each other better and to have an artistic expression in terms of food. Another one of our speakers said that she has a daughter who is a teacher and has encouraged, first grade, has encouraged the students there to write stories. And in writing the stories, the children tell about their families, their cultures, and their experiences. And the wonderful thing about these story writing processes, you can illustrate as well as write. And some people know that the public schools has a big project like that, right? Okay. And I teach teachers who are going to be working with children in the grades under 5. And so I've talked to them about telling their particular stories. What do you remember in your childhood? How did your mom raise you around certain issues? And in exchanging information about how they have been reared by their mothers or grandmothers or brothers and sisters, they grow up with they kind of, in the ability in the classrooms, work really well with projects together because they now have a friend who has had a similar experience. And so when I stick them with somebody, they can work together and have some conversation with it. So this thing of using art to build community is very, very important in all levels. And they have many stories like the quilts. Yeah.
Conversation at our table. Well, first off, I have to say, most of us here are from College of DuPage, and the topic we're talking about on Wednesday was the arts. So I would like to thank both partners for providing us with an excellent example of what we were just talking about in class. A lot of the things that we discussed at our table came up at, sounds like some other tables talking about processes of assimilation, all those sorts of things. And then also just thinking a little bit about artistic expression and trying to think of it outside the box a little bit. One woman who she had to leave, but she was talking about how she felt in her community that folks really came together over cooking and how cooking can be an art form, and the process of gathering the ingredients and especially recipes. She brought up tamales that are very time intensive, and then also the ability to teach those recipes through the generations, that becomes a vehicle through which people can maintain their heritage through the generations. And then I challenge my students to think about the time they spend online creating their Facebook identities as a method of, or a process of artistic expression, and interestingly enough, creating and maintaining online community. So maybe an interesting way to think about things.
Okay, excuse me. Over at our table, I was lucky to be sitting with some of the presenters and a professor of history, so we had a pretty interesting conversation. But actually, the main thing we talked about was already touched on by a table back there, which involved the kind of the shame, the person who mentioned shame. and not looking back into history. We kind of pointed out that that was a common connection between the two. In other words, people being ashamed of having a slave ancestry, and also in the case of the Irish music, some of the younger people not being interested in embracing that. So basically what we came up with, not that we have a plan or anything, but what that led to in our conversation is that America seems to be very kind of, as the professor put it, youth-oriented and very concerned about moving forward, right? We're here now, we're doing this, and not that that is bad at all, but also there is this past that if it were confronted, probably wouldn't end up being so problematic as it sometimes comes out to be.
And we had a very small conversation over here, and I think I can add that one thing Noel mentioned that I thought was very interesting was that when people tell histories, sometimes they make them better than they actually were in some sense. So they're trying to tell the story that will be well received rather than the one that maybe they're still not ready to tell, the one they're not ready to accept or talk about in public. And that does bring up that issue of, I think in my introductory remarks, I mentioned that last month's event was very much about presenting outwardly the image of your community that you can be proud of and want to be proud of and project to the outside world. And to realize that in a sense when we're talking about telling history, it's always this fine line of, telling the accurate history, but also telling the history that will be accepted and that you can feel pride in. And there's maybe a tension between those to be thought about as well. And when we think about cultures, also to be thinking in terms of, I think with both of these groups, and correct me if I'm wrong, Pat, you said some of these abolitionists are actually European Americans. So when you're talking about this quilt project traveling to the schools, this is in a sense representing the possibility of a broader community than just an African American community. It's people who feel solidarity around the quilts and the history that's there. And it's not limited just to one group to feel that solidarity. And with the Irish music, with Noel talking about, he doesn't limit his students to just Irish students, so he's building a community of Irish music musicians, which can be larger than people of Irish American descent. So we're kind of, especially through the arts, when you're remaking culture, you can remake it, more broadly than maybe the foundation that you're working from would have been, and be thinking about that dynamic aspect of culture. So thanks for coming out. We appreciate it, and hopefully we'll see you in March.